So it's going to seem like we've switched directions here in the narrative, but we haven't. Instead, what I'm doing here is kind of zooming out a bit and looking at what's happening on the Greater Plains to show you what's happening to other Native nations, Native peoples, um, to make sure that you understand that the federal government at large is looking not only at the southeastern tribes of Indian Territory, but looking at Native peoples throughout the Great Plains. So that when I tell you they are looking at the tribal peoples of Indian Territory and asking them to give up their lands and move to make way for new people. They are doing it specifically with these Plains Indians tribes in mind. And so I want to talk to you about these Plains Indians peoples and explain to you what's happening to them. So when we talk about the time period here, I'm only going to focus on the 17 years of 1860 to 1877, but I want you to be mindful of the fact that the Plains Indians Wars in general really take place from 1856 to 1877. So, really, over the course of 21 years. Um, so it's a 21-year time period, but we're only looking at 17 years. And when we talk about the battles largely taking place, especially for the Great Plains. Now, this particular map is looking at the entirety of the Trans Mississippi West. But when we talk about the Great Plains region, we're actually talking about everything that takes place all throughout this area, right? So we are looking at everything throughout this region here in the Great Plains. But notice, I want to bring your attention to everything that happens. The fact that there is violence that will happen even here throughout the West, the Pacific Northwest in particular, and it'll happen even out west in Nevada and in California. But we're focusing again largely here in the Great Plains. And here's what I want to make sure that you understand the reason why this entire region is significant for U.S. history in particular during this time period. So, this particular region in the United States is dominated by one particular breed of animal, and that's the buffalo. And the buffalo is the central part, the central. Um, character or the central identity of Plains Indians culture. Plains Indians culture, make note of this in your notes, is different from Southeastern culture. So Southeastern cultures are completely different. They hunt or they come from hunting backgrounds, but they are not centered on or they were not centered on the buffalo. Plains Indians cultures were. So Plains Indians culture centered themselves on the buffalo, and that's because the buffalo dominated the plains. And these things are important for you to remember because this entire region is dominated by hundreds of thousands of people living throughout these regions and hunting throughout these regions. And of course, you have millions of buffalo living breeding, and hunting and dominating these areas. The other thing is the federal government is trying to clear this entire area or make this area clear for railroads, right? That's the problem is there is this push to go west, right? there is this push to go out west for nothing other than railroads, right? You want to be able to make the way clear for American settlement, and the way that it's going to be dominated is by the railroads. Remember, you have things like wagon trains and that sort of thing, and they can only go so far. What's really going to clear the way will be the railroads. Now, we have talked about the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851 before. So if you need a refresher, go back to previous lectures where we talked about how this was the treaty that was signed for Northern Plains tribes. And it was designed to reduce intertribal conflict and prevent confrontations with Americans who were moving out west. Particularly for the California Gold Rush. And then it's the beginning, essentially, of the process of losing the West for the Native peoples. What is really going to change things, though, is that it's the beginning of the end, right? It's the process of losing more of the West, because in 1858 you have the Colorado Gold Rush, and that will lead to the Treaty of Fort Wise in 1861. So the Treaty of Fort Wise in 1861 will reduce native lands to a 13th of what it was under the Fort Laramie Treaty. And so I want to talk about this treaty for a second, just to sort of explain how important it is. So you'll notice that this was a treaty specifically for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. Under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Treaty of Fort Laramie allowed the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes to have access and control of or live on this land that has been grayed out here. The Treaty of Fort Wise of 1861 reduced that to this area in black. And the reason why this treaty was signed was specifically to appease white settlers who had moved into the area, specifically into places like Denver, as well as into the city of Pueblo. So Denver and Pueblo had become incredibly important and very quickly populated, primarily because of the gold rush, as well as because of silver. So silver and gold were the big, you know, big appeal with Colorado. And of course, remember, once people had made the move to come out west, they weren't going to go back out east. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that, you know, um, there is this push to from these white settlers to reduce the amount of land that Native peoples live on, and move them out of the way, because all of these white people are living in the area and wanting to settle in the area. And the Native peoples are considered in the way of white progress, which should sound familiar to you, because that's exactly the kind of message that Andrew Jackson delivered in 1830. And it's going to lead to a tremendous amount of violence, right? Because you have a contest, right? All of this tension that rises over the issue of land. And then, of course, there will be this tension over where these tribal people reside. I'm going to go back specifically to highlight where these people live. So, the Cheyenne and Arapaho are reduced to this amount of land. And what ends up happening is rumors start to spread that where they live is actually rich with silver. Now, there is no truth to this; it's just a rumor, but that's literally all it takes, right? The rumor is enough. And in November of 1864, um, there is a movement organized to drive the Cheyenne and Arapaho off of this land in order to have access to the silver that is allegedly on this land. This movement, this attack, is led by a guy named John Chivington. John Chivington was a colonel with the Union Army during the Civil War, and in 1864, he was honorably discharged. He had done his time, and he comes to Colorado. He was a trained minister. He had political ambitions, and he was also a racist. He had made it pretty clear that he had no kind of positive feelings for Native peoples. As you can see, damn any man, he said, who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. So he organized the 3rd Colorado Cavalry to launch an attack um, on Sand Creek. So Sand Creek was near Fort Lyon, Colorado, which was land set aside for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. It was protected by the U.S. government. And under this treaty, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were given 2 flags, the U.S. flag and a white flag of surrender. And essentially, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were told, if you wave these 2 flags, it's a clear message to anyone and everyone who threatens you that you are here under the protection of the federal government and you are here under peaceful terms. So the on November of 1864, these men, Chivington and the 3rd Cavalry, wait until, so this is November 29th, as you can see on the map here. They wait on purpose. They wait until the men of the tribe have gone out on a hunting trip. And as the men leave for the hunting trip, Chivington and the cavalry make themselves known. And Black Kettle, who is the chief of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes, Black Kettle, who also has a reputation for being a man of peace, raises the American flag and the white flag as he is instructed to do. And Chivington and his men attack anyway. So you'll notice on this diagram that Chivington and his men total around 675 troops. And they launched their attack. When we talk about this particular attack, keep in mind they come with howitzers, which is essentially in the 1860s their version of automatic weapons, very quick to reload. They come and organize themselves into these different companies. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is there are a couple of companies that decide not to attack when they see the 2 flags waving. They choose not to attack because they say, oh, the flags wave. Clearly, this is a message of peace. And decide to stay as witnesses because they know this is going to be a problem. This encampment, because the men have gone off on this hunting trip, is essentially mostly women, children, and the elderly. And of course, Black Kettle, as he is the chief. So when the attack is launched, the people go to hide. Members of the tribe go to hide. This is where they go to hide. There are about 100 men, and then the women and children dig in to hide here. And as you can see from the arrows, the soldiers come here to attack them anyway. There are horrifying stories of children who are trying to run away, and children as young as the age of 2 who are running away and are used as target practice by these soldiers. When all is said and done, um, this horrifying story is results in 133 people dead, 105 of them women and children. And when we talk about these victims, there is a congressional investigation that reveals that the victims were mutilated. These soldiers will take scalps um, and will mutilate them in the sense that they take these body parts as battle trophies. So there were pregnant women there, and their bodies are cut apart, and the fetuses, as well as male and female genitalia, they were used as battle trophies. These soldiers are will actually travel to places like Pueblo and march in parades and use these body parts as things that they brag about. This is a quote from one of the soldiers who testified, one of the soldiers who were witnesses to this massacre and testify about what he saw. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. When we talk about the impact that this is going to have, um, Americans are actually horrified by this, um, for a couple of reasons. One, that American soldiers would behave this way, and that they would behave this way towards Black Kettle and towards his people who have a reputation of being peaceful. Um, but on the flip side of that, you have violence breaking out throughout the Great Plains, because what is the use in signing treaties if this is how the treaties are regarded, right? Um, and that's the thing. If the treaties are regarded in this way, considered this way, then what is the real point? Um, and that's the thing. Sand Creek is not an isolated incident. This sort of violence happens a lot, and it happens to other tribes, and it will happen to other northern tribes and southern tribes, and it is scattered, right? So that leads me to how the federal government responds. The federal government will establish in 1867 the Indian Peace Commission, um, in an effort to establish not only a peace treaty, but a series of trade treaties. So it creates two treaties, one with the Southern Plains tribes and the other with Northern Plains tribes. This is one is the Treaty of Medicine Lodge for the Southern Plains tribes. It's based in Medicine Lodge, Kansas. The other is the Treaty of Fort Laramie for the Northern Plains tribes, and that's based in Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Do not confuse this with the other Fort Laramie treaty. So the other Fort Laramie treaty is from 1851. This is 1868. So just keep that straightened out in your mind. So these are two different treaties. Now, they are two different treaties, but the treaties are different in name only. The conditions of the treaties are the same. When we talk about these treaties, I do want you to bear in mind what these conditions are. So make sure you write this down. Both treaties created reservations. The importance of reservations are that they are distinct locations where each tribe would live, right? So just like with this five southeastern tribes, you have a location for the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, and so forth. It's the same thing here. You have a distinct location for um, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. You have a distinct location for the Lakota Sioux. You have a distinct location for the Navajo. You have a distinct location for everyone, right? That's the first condition. It creates reservations. The second condition is that there would be payments made in goods and services. Payments would be made in goods and in services. The third is that each tribe would be assigned a reservation agent. A federal agent would be assigned to each tribe. Now, the problem with that is not every reservation agent wants to be a reservation agent. That's the kicker. Not everybody wants to be a reservation agent. So you're not going to necessarily have a guy who's going to be an advocate for you. That's going to be really problematic. Um, the fourth condition here is that you are going to be expected, you as the tribe, you will be expected to start giving up your life or your livelihood as farmers and as hunters and start living as farmers, right? So, in other words, change your lifestyle. And in fact, when we talked about the payments being made in goods and services, a part of the goods and services is that you would be given supplies and training on how to be farmers. So, in other words, you've got to change your entire culture, your entire identity to now be farmers and not hunters. That's a big one. So put a star by that one in your notes. Changing your entire identity from hunters to farmers. There's a reason why behind that. So keep that in mind. Okay. So when we get into how things are going with the West, it leads us right back into Indian territory and a full circle moment with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, because the Cheyenne and Arapaho will sign their treaty. Black Kettle will sign his treaty essentially for the sake of keeping the peace and for the sake of survival. Um, and it will lead him to Western Indian Territory, as you can see from the map. Send him and his people right to the Washita River, and it brings us to November of 1868. Part of the struggle for Black Kettle is the fact that the young men in his tribe are incredibly frustrated with the treaty that tells them that they have to give up their identity as warriors and become farmers instead. Because remember, they've been raised to believe that their entire identity as a tribe, their entire identity as men, is all based on being hunters. And now the government is telling them they've got to be farmers. And Black Kettle gave up their identity uh, to be farmers, right? So there's a bit of rebellion against Black Kettle, a bit of rebellion against the government. So these young men are being violent, violating the treaty, stealing stuff from white settlements, including food, horses, all of that stuff. And as a result, the US government um, decides to send in the 7th Cavalry. So this is not a rogue group of white dudes coming in off of a rumor of silver. This is the federal government coming in and sending in um, the 7th Cavalry and under the leadership of George Custer. Um, Custer, at this point, even though Custer does have the reputation of being Custer, and you know, having gone AWOL a couple of times so he can take pictures or hook up with his wife. Um, but maybe you've heard that story already. Um, Custer leads the 7th Cavalry to launch a surprise attack on the Cheyenne almost 4 years to the day that Sand Creek happens. And the 7th Cavalry lead this massacre on Black Kettle and the Cheyenne. Um, and what ends up happening is when this attack takes place, there is 11 inches of snow on the ground. So, of course, the Cheyenne aren't expecting an attack. Um, the warriors are again gone from the tribe on a hunt, but they're not that far away. So there is a bit of a fight here. But in the end, Black Kettle and his wife are killed. And what ends up happening is you will have once again, battles that will erupt all over the plains because the government is trying to enforce these treaties and failing. Um, because, well, for a lot of reasons, when we talk about enforcing these treaties, Native peoples feel restricted and feel like they're being forced to assimilate and they hate it, right? Um, when we talk about what's taking place, in particular, with what's happening with the Red River War, for example, the Red River War is the perfect example of forced assimilation and the failure with forced assimilation. These were young warriors who didn't want to be farmers, um, who didn't want to have to deal with the question of assimilation either. Um, Furthermore, um, you also are dealing with these issues and frustrations of increased crime around their reservations. There is the issue of um, white settlers and not white settlers, but white criminals who come around their reservations, steal their horses and steal their food, and nothing is done about these criminals. Furthermore, the government hasn't been showing up and keeping up their end of the bargain. For example, there's the story of one particular group of Native peoples. This is on the northern plains, who, when they try to, um, this is the Lakota Sioux, when they got their food from the government, their food was actually spoiled and completely rotten. It wasn't good enough for them to eat. And so when they approached the Indian agent in charge of giving them food, they they said, "Listen, this isn't going to work because it's spoiled, and we can't eat it." So this person is actually from Minnesota. So this person, the Indian agent, who was in charge of making sure that everything was fulfilled on both sides, this Indian agent was not only the Indian agent, but he was also a storekeeper. He refused to help them whatsoever. He said, "Well, tell your people to eat the grass." And Red Cloud, Chief Red Cloud, was not the one. Um, so what ended up happening to this guy was, and this took place actually. Um, pretty early on during the Plains Indians Wars. What took place was he was actually on the first day of these wars um, murdered pretty early on. Uh, and he was, well, his mouth was stuffed with grass, as were other areas of his body. Let's just leave it at that. Um, they were disrespected, right? Their culture was disrespected because their identity was challenged as warriors, right? They were told that they had to be farmers and not warriors. Um, Outsiders were stealing their food and their supplies. Their rations weren't actually allowed. There was no law enforcement. And that brings me to the whole point of the buffalo. Look at all of the uses that the buffalo had provided for their culture. The buffalo is used from head to toe, including the dung, right? And for everything from survival to like with food to clothing to shelter and religious ceremonies. The skull itself is used for religious ceremonies. Um, So you can see how important the buffalo is to Plains Indians culture, right? When they hunt the buffalo, it is training for them on how to become warriors, but it's also vital for them for survival. It's also cultural identity, it's religious meanings, it's everyday life, it's everything, and every part of this buffalo is used, right? And it's all listed right here how important the buffalo is. Um, and then you'll notice what the buffalo becomes. When we talk about what ends up happening, I want to talk to you about how things quickly change because. Um, when these tribes are moved to their reservations, the federal government will actually um, uh, in, insist on the establishment of something called the Buffalo Clause. I'm going to go back for a second and show you how violent things get. So in 1874, when you have the Red River War, you'll notice that this violence takes place throughout the panhandle of Texas. And the when these battles take place, um, what they're doing is they are attacking what's known as buffalo hunting posts. Now, the reason why it takes place in particular is because the US government introduces the Buffalo Clause as a means of appealing or appeasing the native peoples. What ends up happening is the federal government realizes, okay, um, obviously the native people are angry. You don't want to assimilate. You hate the idea. So, what if we put in this condition? And the condition is you can hold on to these traditional ways, these traditional values, as long as the buffalo existed. And that phrase is incredibly important. So if you reject the agencies, if you reject, um, these assimilationist policies, that's fine. You have to go to the reservations. You have to live on the reservations. But if you don't want to be farmers, okay, you can continue to hunt as long as the buffalo existed. As long as the buffalo existed is the phrase that you need to underline in your notes. That's what you need to highlight because as long as the buffalo existed, implies that the buffalo aren't going to exist for much longer. What the government is going to do is start hunting the buffalo themselves. The government starts to hire buffalo hunters, and these buffalo hunters are allowed to kill as many buffalo as they want and do whatever they want with the buffalo. In fact, railroad companies will do the same. And again, the rule is do whatever you want with the buffalo as long as you kill as many buffalo as possible. And what ends up happening is over the course of 4 years, from 1870 to 1874, 7.4 million buffalo are killed. From 1870 to 1874, 7.4 million buffalo are killed. You'll notice on the in the picture on the left, you have all of these collections of buffalo skulls. And you'll remember from the previous diagram that buffalo skulls were specifically used for religious ceremonies. So you can imagine how insulting this would be for Plains Indians tribes. On the right hand side, this cover of Harper's Weekly, which presents itself, as you can see, as the Journal of Civilization, you can see this man who is depicted here skinning a buffalo. This is how it looks all throughout the West, right? Um, Buffalo carcasses are scattered throughout the Great Plains, and it's it's completely devastating for Plains Indians tribes. It's overwhelming to them, um, and that's what the government wants to do, because they're trying to prioritize railroads and Western settlement, and they have no time for Native people. And in the meantime, they develop a new policy for Native peoples, and that is don't bother negotiating with Native people. Instead, uh, you want to remove the leaders. You want to make way for forced assimilation, whatever the cost. And the way you do that is step one, get rid of the leaders. The problem with the leaders is leaders inspire, leaders motivate, leaders organize. And so the way you stop that is by removing them. You can arrest them, you can kill them, just get them out of the way. The other thing that you do is you force the people to assimilate at all costs. And you can do that by one, establishing reservations, and two, establishing boarding schools. Boarding schools are important because it takes the children away from their families, away from their culture, away from their traditions, and it forces them to learn what you teach them to learn. And when I talk about these boarding schools, what's important for you to understand is that these boarding schools are hundreds of miles away from their homes. And it is devastating to Native culture. It is devastating to Native identity. The first thing that happens at these boarding schools is that boys' hair are immediately cut. These children are immediately assigned new names. So all Native names are immediately eliminated and they are given English names. And if you speak your native language, you are beaten. So there's a lot of corporal punishment involved. If you've been paying attention to the news in the last year or 2 years, and in fact, I encourage you, if you haven't been, I can connect you with these news stories. Um, but in the last year, in the last couple of years, they have discovered massive grave sites of children who have gone to boarding schools and who died at these boarding schools because they were starved, because they were beaten to death, because they were exposed to disease. um, and these children um, went unknown or unnamed and unidentified, and for decades um, were not were basically left um, abandoned by these schools, and their parents were never told what happened to their children. Um, and a lot of it was because they were native. You can see in this bottom picture what ends up to the what ends up happening to, for example, this group of children. Anything that is native is forced out of them. Anything that is quote unquote savage or uncivilized is forced out of them, and that's the thing. It's this question of making them more like the Americans, um, and then forcing them to live wherever the government deems is okay for them. On the right hand side, you can see all the areas where they can now live, which should look familiar to you because you saw this map or a familiar map like this in the previous lecture. But now you have all of these tribes living. Now, these aren't all of the tribes from the Great Plains. Northern Plains tribes are living in areas in the north, but there are a lot of Southern Plains tribes now living in Indian Territory.